So welcome everyone. This is our first in-person Bradford seminar since spring of 2020, and I'm totally delighted to see you and to have our speaker here today and to be here myself. I'm Denise Malzerall. I'm a professor joint between Civil Environmental Engineering and the School of Public and International Affairs in the Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment. And for our kickoff speaker for this semester, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Jesse Jenkins, who has a joint appointment in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. Jesse leads the Princeton Zero Lab, the Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Laboratory, which conducts research to improve decision-making to accelerate rapid, affordable, and effective transitions to net zero carbon energy systems. The Princeton Zero Lab also runs the REPEAT project, the Rapid Energy Policy Evaluation and Analysis Toolkit, which provides independent environmental and economic evaluation of federal energy and climate policies as they are proposed and enacted. Their latest report is on the climate and energy impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Jesse's work has been receiving a great deal of attention recently, both from the national policy community and from the press. You've probably seen him quoted already in various mainstream media outlets. He also is very active on Twitter, so after today, if you want to follow him, you join about nearly 70,000 followers he has on Twitter. He's here today to share with us his perspective on the role that the Inflation Reduction Act will play in putting the U.S. on the path to net zero emissions of carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks. I'm delighted to be back and to be here in person. I think I was here 2 years ago. I think it was February 2020. Maybe one of the last in-person Bradford seminars we had to talk about the Net Zero America study, which I was one of the co-PIs of, along with Eric Larson, who's here, I believe. There you are. Which drew on our modeling techniques and unprecedented level of granularity to look at what it would actually take to build a net zero emissions economy across the country. But with a set of stylized pathways to get there, right? Sort of straight line emissions constraints and a variety of different hypothetical paths that we could take to get from here to net zero emissions. What was missing from that study was the policy drivers that might get us there. Now, it's not our job to prescribe policy here at Princeton, although we certainly have technical guidance to offer on a variety of policy relevant questions. But what we wanted to do with the REPEAT project, which we launched after the release of Net Zero America, was to use that same set of tools, detailed energy systems modeling tools that we had developed for Net Zero America, refine them, automate them, speed them up, and use them to assess the impact of federal policy as it was being proposed and as it ideally is being enacted, knowing that we are entering into a period of relatively rare policymaking opportunity with the inauguration of the Biden administration and the 117th Congress in January of 2021. So I'm very excited to share the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act that we have been able to estimate with our modeling. This is a game-changing piece of legislation, which I'll hope to explain why throughout this presentation. So again, the REPEAT project has been a major team effort that has been underway since the spring of 2021. I'm the PI, but we have a great team of folks, including Aaron Mayfield, formerly a postdoctoral scholar here, now a professor at Dartmouth College. The team at Evolved Energy Research, which has done all of the macro scale energy system modeling for this study, as well as the Net Zero America study and a bunch of others you've probably seen. And a variety of folks from our team at Zero Lab, as well as Carbon Impact Consulting. You can check out all of our findings at repeatproject.org, as well as our analysis of previous versions of legislation, including the Build Back Better Act. We have a detailed data portal there that we'll be updating soon to include results from the Inflation Reduction Act as well that you can dive into and extract some of the numbers from. Oh, and if you'd like to go into what's actually in this bill in detail, this link here provides a link to a public spreadsheet that we put out that has all of the pieces, section by section summary of every piece of energy and climate related provisions in both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed last year, as well as the Build Back Better Act, RIP, the House version of this bill that eventually morphed into the Inflation Reduction Act. All right, so what did we do in this modeling? I'll just sort of give you a brief overview of how we go about this analysis to start before jumping into the results. Basically, we start with a set of very geospatially refined inputs. This is a distinction from the Net Zero America study where we developed all of this sort of analysis ex post after we had gotten the results from the modeling That was really the major contribution of the Net Zero America study, was to take results from a macro scale energy system model and then really go as granular as we could, sector by sector, to try to look at, is this really reasonable? What would it look like in terms of infrastructure? Where could we build this stuff? So fortunately, building on all that work, we were able to refine a set of geospatially resolved inputs, by which I mean 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer sweep across the whole country to look at where you could build wind and solar facilities, for example. Try to constrain, even if it passes sort of the initial screening of where you might be able to physically build or build due to administrative protections, there's a maximum density that's likely to be feasible given public opposition and cumulative impacts of these projects. So we tried to understand that. And we also mapped transmission paths from all of those sites to where we consume electricity, usually somewhere far away from those locations. Similarly, these are all the thermal power plants in the country. We have data on that, and we can look at the potential to reuse those sites or retrofit those power plants with carbon capture, repower them as nuclear plants, other opportunities to take advantage of those locations. And then all of that gets aggregated up, right? So we can't model with this level of detail in our energy system models, but we can cluster similar sites that have similar characteristics into an aggregated step that goes into our macro scale energy system models. There's actually 2 tools that we use here. One is called Energy Pathways, and this is a scenario development tool that basically allows us to create different levels and scenarios for demand for all of the energy fuels and energy carriers that we use in the economy. So hydrogen and gasoline and jet fuel and electricity. And for electricity, also to derive the hourly demand profile or shape of electricity demand, because that matters a lot when you combine that sort of variability with the variation in wind and solar output and the need for flexibility and engineering constraints that bind the operation of our thermal power plants in particular. All of that then gets fed into the RIO, which is Resource Investment and Optimization Model, which is an energy system supply side optimization model that has sort of this 14 region aggregate representation of the country. So again, we go from very spatially resolved to 14 regions. We explicitly capture transmission and pipeline constraints between those regions to move things around at the larger scale. But then we implicitly cost out transmission within the regions via this initial routing. So we're not modeling flows across every line within a region, but we at least account for the fact that you have to get power from the wind site to a city within those regions before it can flow to some other region. So all that's at an aggregate scale. This is sort of typical for the types of studies and models that are used to analyze changing energy systems. But then because we started at a granular scale and we kept track of how we packed everything up into the aggregate scale, when we get results, we can unpack them as well. We've automated most of that process so that we can then go right back to the very fine scale and say, where do these projects get built at a local level? And then what are the impacts based on those decisions on things like air pollution at a state or county level and employment at a state level in different sectors, different types of jobs as well. So it's sort of a full suite. It's a variety of tools, again, built off of the background and tool set that we built for Net Zero America and refined for this type of analysis. And the goal or the challenge here with Repeat was to do this very quickly. So it's the rapid energy policy evaluation and analysis toolkit, and Repeat was given because we're going to have to do this repeatedly when bills get introduced and then changed. So some of you might be familiar with the Congressional Budget Office. It's a congressional nonpartisan office that assesses the budgetary impact of legislation as it's being introduced and debated. So that members of Congress can take votes and make decisions about amendments knowing what the impact potentially of that bill. I mean, it's all modeling, so it's an estimate. But the estimated impact of that legislation on the future deficit or revenues from taxes and the budgetary outcome for the federal government. Our goal was essentially to do the same kind of thing, but looking at the energy and climate impacts of that legislation. And ideally do it in the same kind of real-time manner so that it's not done 6 months after the bill passes, but while it's currently being debated so that the information is actionable for people to understand what this bill would do, make decisions, whether that's stakeholders that are trying to influence the process or legislators themselves, with some quantitative foundation for that decision making. All right, so what does the Inflation Reduction Act signify? At its core, I would argue that this bill and the corresponding, the companion infrastructure law that passed in November signify the fact that for the first time in our history, the full financial weight of the federal government is behind the clean energy transition. This has never been the case before, right? We've had sporadic tax credits that are on and off for particular technologies, nothing holistic at the federal level. No, economy-wide legislation has passed at the federal level. The last time we tried to enact law was in 2009, 2010, with a large cap-and-trade bill that failed, the Waxman-Markey bill. And so we've had a piecemeal effort of states and voluntary action by universities and institutions and companies to keep the ball moving, right? The sort of Remain in Paris coalition and all the states that have been pushing forward, including New Jersey, to accelerate the clean energy transition. But the federal government's been out to lunch for the most part, right? They're not part of it. That changes fundamentally with the passage of this law, right? And we'll talk about its impact. But what it effectively does is focus on making clean energy and really the full portfolio of all the kind of stuff you would want to include in a lower carbon energy system or cleaner energy system. It tries to make clean energy cheap, right? It tries to make it cheaper than the conventional fossil fuel alternatives. That's the fundamental focus of this bill. That's in contrast to carbon taxes or emissions regulations that are trying to raise the cost of fossil fuels or limit their use. So the explicit focus of this bill is just to make it a better business decision, to make it a better household financial decision for you and I and everybody, all the businesses across the country, to pick cleaner options, right? Whether that's a utility trying to decide what kind of electricity it wants to get, what sources of electricity it wants to purchase in the future. That's Amazon or Avis car rentals or some fleet manager trying to figure out what kind of vehicles to buy next time they go to procure their fleet vehicles. Or you and I deciding what we want to do to heat our homes or to get around the community. What kind of vehicles do we want to use? Right? So basically everything is supported in this bill to some degree, right? Varying strengths of varying types of policies. By tax credits, that does the bulk of the work of the bill, but also loan guarantees, grants, rebate programs for low-income households that don't have tax liability and can't claim tax credits, for example. So a variety of financial incentives that put their thumb on the scale for the cleaner energy options. And that includes clean electricity. So there's a long-term extension and increase back to the sort of original full value of the production tax credit and investment tax credits, which have been the workhorse policies that have driven the growth of wind and solar power over the last 15 years or so. They're now extended out to at least 2033 and potentially longer because instead of having a fixed sunset date, that policy now sunsets once we reduce electricity sector emissions to 25% of current levels, so 75% reduction. After that, the year after that, they're still full value, and then they phase down over the 2 years after that. So no sooner than 2036 will those incentives be gone entirely, and it could be longer than that if it takes us longer to decarbonize. And the reason it might take longer, as we'll see later, is electricity demand is going to go up at the same time that we're trying to cut emissions, right, from electric vehicles. So we don't know how long that will take, right? Also, after 2025, instead of a list of specific technologies that was how the credits worked before, any carbon-free electricity source qualifies now for these credits. So that includes advanced nuclear, fusion, even if somebody succeeds in commercializing that. But you don't have to get on the list, right? You don't have to have a future piece of legislation amend the law to qualify some new technology. Whatever it is, it qualifies. Energy storage now has a tax credit for the first time, a standalone investment tax credit that's the same magnitude as the investment tax credit for clean electricity. So again, all these sorts of options on the electricity side. Supports hydrogen and clean fuels. There's a new production tax credit for low carbon hydrogen production and synthetic fuels or low carbon fuels like synthetic jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel. Carbon capture and storage has a current tax credit that is increased and extended for the long term as well. It goes from $50 per ton up to $85 per ton under this law if you capture and store CO2, and $60 if you use it in enhanced oil recovery or some industrial process that can consume that CO2. Right? That's enough to change the economics of carbon capture across the country in a variety of locations. Electric vehicles, of course, are subsidized both for individuals and for businesses with two different tax credits, a personal and business tax credit. And then energy efficiency and electrification are supported, again, by tax credits, but also by grant programs and rebate programs, specifically some state-administered rebates for low and middle-income households or owners of multifamily houses that low-income residents live in, where they typically won't have the tax liability to use the tax credits. So that'll help you install more efficient windows or insulation or install an efficient electric heat pump. So really across the board, it supports all of the clean energy options. And then it goes upstream to support clean energy manufacturing as well. So there are new tax credits and loan guarantee programs and grants to help retool automotive manufacturing, support battery assembly, critical minerals processing, and wind and solar component manufacturing in the United States so that we can build the supply chains for these industries. So in addition to the stuff that we focus on directly modeling and repeat, which are the things that drive emissions reductions, I want to, before I dive into the modeling results, highlight a few of the things that are a little more intangible or a little harder for us to model, but I think are nonetheless quite significant and reflect a broader philosophy of the design of this piece of legislation, which is that it's intending to make this stuff stick. This should not be the last policy that we implement, but we also don't want it to be repealed if there's a change in future congressional makeup. And so there's a variety of policies here that try to deliver real, tangible, near-term economic and other benefits for communities all over the country. So that it's not just about avoiding future climate damages, right, which is critical, but is far off in the future. Right? It's also about delivering a better country, right? Delivering cleaner energy, delivering manufacturing jobs across the country, driving investment into communities that need it, and addressing environmental injustices. So the Act builds on the demonstration and hubs funding in the infrastructure law, which is there to sort of fund the first of a kind of a few different key technologies like hydrogen, advanced nuclear, carbon capture, et cetera, by providing the first real market deployment incentives to create an early niche market to pull these technologies into the market once they're ready to go commercial, right, to be commercial scale. And that's critical because that's the same kind of policy that we used to incubate the wind and solar industries and electric vehicle batteries, which have come down in cost dramatically over the last decade, right? Since the last time we tried to pass federal legislation, the cost of wind is now 2/3 below what it was in 2009. And the cost of solar PV and lithium-ion batteries is 1/10 of what it cost when the Congress tried to pass the Waxman-Markey bill, right? So that fundamentally changes the economics, but also the political calculus, right, for how much it takes to act, right? Not just at the federal level in the future, but also globally, right? If we can make these technologies cheaper for the world, it's much more likely that we'll see greater climate ambitions globally as well. So driving innovation and maturation of a range of technologies that aren't going to drive a lot of emissions reductions this decade, but we know we need to complete the overall portfolio or toolkit in the 2030s and 40s so that we can stay on track to net zero. The other thing it does is provides robust support for the development of American manufacturing and supply chains, as I mentioned before. This includes solar and wind and battery and electric vehicle assembly, but also critical minerals processing. So there's a whole list of the periodic table of different elements that are used in manufacturing a lot of these things that today are primarily sourced from overseas and that we want to provide a stronger domestic supply chain for. And those policies are important to expand supply chains, which could be a critical bottleneck to the pace of deployment for all of the things we want to build. So that's about getting the emissions reductions we need. But just as importantly, and probably the primary motivation for this, is that it can create hundreds of thousands, probably a couple million on that order of magnitude, new manufacturing jobs across communities across the country, which gives countless communities a more direct, tangible stake in the economics of a clean energy transition. Right? When you know somebody who works in this industry, or your town's tax base is tied to that industry, it's a very different proposition. Right? For environmental justice communities, communities on the fence lines of polluting facilities across the country, or next to highways and other ports and other heavily polluting areas that have borne the brunt of the environmental impacts of our current fossil energy system, the bill directs at least $60 billion to specifically try to reduce emissions and pollution in those environmentally overburdened communities, and also to ensure more equitable access to renewable energy, energy efficiency, electrification, the sort of clean energy solutions that we want everyone to have access to across the economy. And finally, there's a set of incentives in the bill. There's some grants and also loans, and then bonus tax credits that are meant to drive investments, which we estimate will be at least hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade, into what the bill calls energy communities, which is effectively traditional fossil energy producing parts of the country. Right? So places that have a relatively significant level of employment in fossil energy extraction, transport, processing, et cetera, or where coal mines or coal plants have recently closed, they are likely to see a substantial bonus for investment in those communities that will drive some of the clean energy investments and manufacturing through the 48C tax credit into communities that today their economies depend primarily on fossil energy production and extraction, but now will have a more direct and clear economic stake in the clean energy industries as well. So all of this is, very purposeful. It's designed to deliver broad benefits that can build and sustain a political coalition that will make future actions easier and hopefully make repeal of any of these policies much more difficult politically. So that's sort of a high-level anatomy of the bill. It's a huge bill. There's $370 billion of estimated expenditures. We think that's probably low based on our modeling. So it's a $500 billion-ish scale investment over the next decade, and dozens of individual provisions, but that's sort of the high-level philosophy. Make clean energy cheap, deliver real tangible benefits, make it easier to take action in the future. Okay, so what does it mean in terms of emissions? Well, we've seen emissions in the US going down since about 2005 to 2007, when we peaked out at about 6.6 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, a carbon dioxide equivalent. And we've seen that fall by about 1 billion tons through 2021, so about 5.6 billion tons. Under a frozen policy scenario that we modeled, so assuming no new action during the current Congress or administration, that was projected to continue a bit, another 0.7 billion tons of decline, but nowhere near the pace that we need to be, which is down here, to hit the president's goal, which is to cut emissions 50% below our peak levels by 2030. That's the goal the president has pledged to the international community as our nationally determined contribution at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change conventions. And it gets us halfway to the ultimate goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which is where we need to be in order to stop digging a deeper hole, right? To stop contributing to the concentration, the increasing concentration of atmospheric greenhouse gases, which is going to keep driving global warming until we get to net zero and then ideally beyond to net negative. So we got a big gap here to fill, right? This is the task of the current Congress. And we put together a repeat project largely to figure out how far we are, right? How far do we still have to go and how far have we gotten? And to update that kind of on a continual basis. So the first thing we did was assess the impact of the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, which passed in November of last year. It has a bunch of important technology investments, right? Sort of demonstration funding, about $60 billion for the Department of Energy, largely for commercial demonstration and infrastructure, not the kind of typical R&D that they do, to try to drive more nascent technologies and de-risk them. And some infrastructure, enabling infrastructure like EV charging funding and transmission lines. But nothing that really drives a lot of emissions reductions in the near term. So it's sort of like building the foundation for future emissions cuts, but nothing that really drives significant emissions cuts right now. And so we estimated that it would cut emissions by less than 100 million tons. Or maybe about 1 percentage point of our 2005 levels. So a nice start, but still a lot of work to do. In fact, we estimated that without the Inflation Reduction Act, the US faced a 1.5 billion ton per year emissions gap in 2030. So that's the sort of yawning gap that we were looking at when the couple times it looked like Congress wasn't going to be able to pass anything. That this is where we would end up, really nowhere, right? Barely getting started. Now, fortunately, Congress did succeed in passing the Inflation Reduction Act this summer. It's a trimmed-down version of the Build Back Better Act that passed the previous passed the House alongside the the Infrastructure Act. The total funding for the energy and climate portion was largely intact, however, while a bunch of the broader social spending and inequality, focused policies that were in Build Back Better, which would have been transformative as well, were stripped out over time. About 2/3 of the funding for energy and climate investments remain in the bill, and that ended up being the bulk of the revenue or the expenditures in the Inflation Reduction Act. But fortunately, the bill was able to cut emissions, under our estimates, by about 1 billion metric tons per year. That's about 75% of the annual reductions in 2030. And it cut emissions by about 2/3 of the remaining gap that we had. Right? So we still have about 1/3 left, or 500 million tons. But that's a lot of work for a single piece of legislation to do. And it cuts cumulative emissions over the next decade by 6.3 billion tons or thereabouts, which is about 80% of the work that we estimated the Build Back Better Act would do. So we lost a third of the funding, but we only lost a fifth of the emissions reductions impact. And that, in some ways, is due to the quantitative insights of this type of modeling, that we were able to help Senate staff and negotiators understand the pieces that had the biggest climate bang for the buck, and a very focused effort of those staffers to try to make sure that this bill had a big impact, right? It was a very clear consensus that something had to pass and that something had to be big enough to make a dent in this global challenge, right? Unfortunately, I think we succeeded on that front, even though we lost some ground as the legislation moved along. And being able to model repeatedly the different versions of this bill, we modeled the initial version of Build Back Better in September. The first draft, we modeled the final version that passed the House in November, and then we were waiting around for a long time, and then eventually got to model the Inflation Reduction Act this summer in July. So we can sort of see how things evolve over time. All right, so how does it drive those reductions? We'll sort of break down the pieces. So again, the size of this wheel, this pie, is the 1.5 billion tons of additional work that we needed the bill to do, right? It didn't do all of it, so there's still this gap. But the work that it does do is split across these sectors. And you can see that at the first glance, that it hits all of the major emitting sectors of the economy, right? So it truly is an economy-wide effort, even though the bulk of the emissions reductions are from the transportation and power sectors. Those are our number 1 and 2 emitting sectors, respectively. But they're also the ones with the most mature solutions today, right? Thanks to prior policy and investment in the US as well as elsewhere, we've made solar and wind from expensive alternative energy technologies into cheap mainstream trillion-dollar industries, and we can scale them substantially this decade. And the same is true for electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries. And so that's where the bulk of the emissions reductions comes from in this next decade, about a little over 600 million tons of total from power and transportation. The Act also incentivizes installation of energy efficiency and productivity improvement upgrades in industry and industrial carbon capture that we project would reduce emissions by about 130 million tons across industry, which is the number 3 emitting sector in the economy, and probably will end up number 1 before too long as we make progress in these two. And then across the range of other options, we see a set of grants, tax credits, and rebates that help promote energy efficiency and electrification of our building stock, which is key. This is probably underpowered. It's an area we can certainly do more in the future to make additional reductions. And we see reductions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, primarily methane. This is the only stick in the bill. There's lots of carrots, right? Lots of funding to make things easier to do the clean thing. Not a lot of penalties for dirty stuff. The exception to that is the methane fee, which is a fee on upstream oil and gas related methane emissions that leak out from our oil and gas supply chain. And that's a major source of greenhouse gases. Methane's really potent in the short term, so it drives a lot of near-term warming. And it's also really cost-effective to reduce, so it makes a ton of sense to go after those reductions in the near term. And that's going to work hand in hand with a new EPA regulation that's being proposed that we haven't modeled yet. We'll model that later on, that will also help reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sectors. The reduction of overall oil and gas production will also help reduce leakage, and we try to estimate that impact as well. And then there is a set of policies that help improve carbon sequestration and storage in agricultural and forestry land, so our land use sectors. That includes efforts to reduce wildfire risk and fuel burden in forests to prevent the carbon stored in our trees from going up in smoke and of course, leading to substantial air pollution. And efforts to promote conservation agricultural practices that can enhance the sustainability of agricultural lands, but also help sequester carbon in soils and the root structures of the plants that we grow. So it really touches everything. Again, there's more to be done, particularly on these sectors down here, but it also helps set the stage by improving technologies that are available to reduce emissions further, such as industrial carbon capture and heat pumps, which will see a lot larger uptake and hopefully lower costs over time. All right, now, it doesn't do everything we need to do, and that's important to stress. The job is not done, but I do think it is fundamentally changed because now the federal government is picking up a big chunk of the tab, right? It's making it cheaper and easier for every other level of action that you could think of to take even more ambitious action. So whatever level of ambition made sense for Princeton, right, as an institution, or for Google as a big company, or for the state of New Jersey, whatever made economic or political sense before the passage of this law that all got a lot cheaper, which means you could probably do a lot more for whatever budget you had in mind. Right? And so I would expect this to drive a whole set of follow-on actions and ambitions that increase over time at all other levels of government and individual or institutional corporate action. And every new piece of regulation that the Biden administration might be thinking about has to go through a regulatory impact assessment. And that always involves a look at two things, the sort of societal cost-benefit analysis and the cost of compliance with whatever regulation is proposed. And while these tax credits and things are mostly transfers, so they don't really affect the societal cost-benefit analysis much, because you're just taking money from taxes here and giving it to someone else, it does fundamentally change the cost of compliance question. So for example, if you're talking about tailpipe emission standards for 2027 through 2032, which the EPA is promulgating now, whatever level of made sense for the auto industry to do before, now we're subsidizing all of those solutions heavily, and so you can probably have more ambitious regulation. Same thing with 111D power plant regulations for existing power plants. Right now, carbon capture is an economically viable option for power plants to pursue, so you could probably increase the level of ambition there. So it's going to have a synergistic effect on the executive actions that the White House takes as well, and they know this and they're working hard on that. Okay, so it's called the Inflation Reduction Act. That's not all just tongue-in-cheek, effort to rebrand something and put lipstick on a pig. It truly is a legitimate, reality that this bill will drive down costs for households and businesses for the two of the biggest drivers of inflation right now, right? Healthcare, right? Because the rest of the bill is focused on negotiating prescription drug prices and providing Affordable Care Act subsidies that would otherwise have expired for millions of Americans. And energy, which is the biggest driver of inflation right now, fuel costs, right? Prices at the pump, prices for goods and services are going up because of transportation costs going up. And while it's not going to have a big impact this year, right? So it's probably not going to help with this year's inflation. It will substantially lower energy costs into the medium term and hopefully avoid the next big super cycle of commodity price spikes, or at least insulate us from the impacts of those spikes in the future. And so our estimate is that the tax credits, rebates, and federal investments in the Act are going to shift costs from energy bills, which tend to be regressive from a equity perspective, to the much more progressive federal tax base. And in particular, this bill is paid for by a new corporate minimum tax of 15% on billion-dollar-plus revenue corporations and higher IRS enforcement on tax cheats. Right? So it's big billion-dollar companies and tax cheats paying for cheaper energy. And we estimate that the direct reduction in costs of lower energy consumption here and the basically shifting the costs in the form of incentives to the tax base will lower energy costs for households and businesses across the country by about 4% by 2030. That's about $50 billion annually that we won't be spending on our energy bills anymore. And that doubles by 2035, right, to about 8% or $100 billion annually. Those savings don't account for the macroeconomic price effects of lowering US consumption of oil and gas, which we don't estimate, our models don't have, that's one of the limitations of our models, is they don't have sort of an oil and gas elasticity model in them or supply curve. So we estimated ex post using a simpler supply and demand elasticity spreadsheet kind of model, what the potential impact on global prices for crude oil and North American prices for natural gas could be from lowering our consumption of oil and gas. And those are also significant. Something like a 5% reduction in global crude oil prices from lowering US consumption of oil and gas. That's, of course, in addition to everything Europe is doing to dramatically reduce their consumption at the same time. And a 10 to 20% reduction in North American natural gas prices. And that range is quite large because of the fact that it's harder to model the partially coupled US or North American gas market, where we have some amount of trade globally, but it's limited. And so 10% is as if it was a fully globally integrated market, and 20% is if we had no trade with the rest of the world. So the reality will probably be somewhere in between. Right? Those are big reductions in future costs. And again, those increase over time. Okay, so if you were to sum this up in a nutshell, billion-dollar corporations and tax cheats paying more in taxes for all of us to get cheaper, cleaner energy, and to build more of it here in the United States. Sounds like a pretty good deal to me. I'm pretty excited about it. I hope you guys are too. This is a big piece of legislation, and because it's framed this way, as opposed to, say, an energy tax that will hamper American competitiveness and raise costs at the pump, it's going to be a lot more politically durable than other strategies for energy policy. May not be as efficient or elegant, right? If you're an economist, you probably are cringing at all of these individual subsidies, and there are definitely subsidies in here that are too strong or not strong enough, or going to subsidize a lot of what, quote unquote, inframarginal purchases that would have otherwise happened. But it's also going to be effective, right? It's, sustained a political coalition, it got passed, it's going to drive 1 billion tons of emissions reductions annually in 2030, and I think it's going to set us up to build on these policies in the future. All right, so it's also going to drive some pretty fundamental shifts in the energy economy. For all of American history, since we first discovered oil and natural gas, we have consumed more and more of it outside of temporary declines during recessions, right? So it's gone up and up and up. Here's petroleum, kind of leveled off, but still increasing on a trend line. Same thing for natural gas. So outside of recessions, we've just been using more and more of this stuff year on year. This bill is likely to drive the first sustained decline in oil and gas consumption in US history. Our estimates are that the Inflation Reduction Act will drive US petroleum product consumption, so gasoline, jet fuel, diesel, et cetera, down by about 13% versus 2021, and that'll almost double to 25% in 2035. That's a big reduction, right? So we're going to start to see that trend reverse and a steady and sustained decline in oil product consumption, and about an 8% decline from 2021 levels in natural gas consumption as well. It's not quite as steep, but there is a substantial reduction in natural gas consumption also. Now, it's also going to reverse another trend, which is that since 2005, we had basically flat demand for electricity. Right? Energy efficiency improvements and everything else has offset the growing size of our economy and GDP. And so we've seen about flat demand, stagnant demand since 2005. And by driving electrification of transportation and heating, the bill is going to reverse that, and it's going to drive, again, a sustained period of electricity demand growth that we really haven't seen since the 1970s and 80s. We estimate about 24% growth by 2030 over 2019 levels, and 43%, or roughly 40%, by 2035. So big increases in demand. And that, again, is, those two changes alone are going to fundamentally shift the sort of economic outlook for investment in those two sectors, respectively. Right? Even going from a modestly growing to a modestly shrinking industry, or vice versa, has huge implications for the business case, right, for future investment. So it's going to drive a lot of investment into the electricity sector and maybe a lot less in future oil and gas production. All right, it fundamentally makes the economics line up behind the clean energy transition. And so now the challenge is not, does this make sense? Is it affordable? Is it a good business decision? The challenges are really more around how fast can we scale things up? Right? How fast can we build infrastructure? How fast can we site transmission lines? How fast can we train millions of new workers to enter these growing industries every year? Or not every year, but in aggregate over the decade. How fast can we build out the supply chains that you need, all the materials that need to go into these things? Right? So these are likely to be the new challenges that are going to be the primary focus for public policy and for industries and everybody else to try to solve over the next decade. And to give a sense of what that looks like, this chart shows our historical deployment of electricity generation capacity over the last, since the 1950s. You can see sort of the build out of coal and gas and nuclear in orange here, and then the big surge of natural gas in the 2000s, and then the growing and increasing contribution from wind and solar in blue and yellow. But we have to smash new records of deployment for the rest of the decade. So these are the growth rates that we see in our modeling as making economic sense for wind and solar, effectively doubling the 2020 pace of deployment for wind by 2025, and quintupling the pace, 5x increase for solar, and then solar just keeps going. Whoa. Sure what's going on there. Projector is getting a little excited. So you can see, getting up to somewhere like 100 gigawatts per year of deployment of solar by the end of the decade. All right? Now, this is what makes economic sense, but there's also, I should say, carbon capture deployment potentially at a handful of coal retrofits and some new natural gas power plants. Now, I want to stress, this is what makes economic sense in our modeling. Our modeling is fundamentally a least cost optimization model. It's trying to meet supply and demand, subject to all the policy and engineering constraints at the lowest cost. We try to factor in things like where you can site solar and how much it costs to expand transmission and things like that. We do have some rate limiting growth, so you can't go from 0 to 100 gigawatts a year in 1 year. Right? Have to increase over time. But there are a lot of other non-financial barriers that could easily constrain the pace of deployment for these technologies, particularly wind, solar, and transmission, which is needed to support all of this wind and solar. And so I would say you should treat our modeling as indicative of what makes good financial sense, not necessarily a prediction of exactly what's going to happen if we don't overcome some of those non-financial barriers. Now, there are some things in these laws that help overcome those barriers. There's funding for CO2 transport and injection basins. In the infrastructure law, there's some transmission funding, limited amounts. There's funding for all of the agencies involved in the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA review process, for which we have to do environmental impact statements. There's a couple $2 billion spread across all those agencies to staff up and expedite NEPA review, which is often a barrier for these projects. So not to dilute the quality, no changes to the law, just to do it faster with more people. And other sorts of things. So that helps. But I also want to note that the fact that there are now billions of dollars of profit to be made overcoming these barriers. There's billions of dollars of ratepayer savings for state utility commissioners to unlock for their customers. There's billions of dollars of local economic development potential for local county commissioners and state officials to tap into. There are now a lot of financial incentives to overcome those barriers. So those barriers existed before this law. This law does not bring them down on its own, but it certainly makes it good for a lot of people to overcome those barriers. So I think it's more likely that we're going to see success than it was before. Can't guarantee it, but that is important to stress too. All right, so as an example of what this looks like and to show off some of our downscaling capabilities or mapping, this is a map of 2022 modeled additions. This is not reality because we started this. We had to model 2022 because we don't know what the year is going to look like yet. But this is what our model thinks makes sense to build this year for wind and solar additions. And you can see our existing wind farms in light blue. It's a little hard to see on the screen. Some solar, if you look real close here, in light yellow. And then these darker colors are new wind farms that the model wants to build, that we basically decide which regions and which clusters the model wants to pick of sites in each of the regions, and then we unpack those down to the individual sites. And we also look at some of the interregional transmission that might need to expand. Well, this is what it might look like by 2032 in terms of new wind and solar additions. Right? So this is a lot of new projects all over the country. You look at the red here, it's again not so great with this projector, but there's a lot of large-scale utility solar as well. There's less of an extensive visual footprint as wind, so you don't see it as much on the maps. But there's hundreds of gigawatts of solar built as well. And then the transmission infrastructure to tap into that. And our modeling indicates that we need to basically grow the transmission grid at more than 2% per year, which is a little over double the rate that we've achieved over the last decade. It is in line with the historic rate that we saw from the 1980s through the 2000s. The average rate of expansion when electricity demand was growing was about 2% per year. But we have not been anywhere close to that in recent years. We've been about 1% per year. So now we need to double or more the pace of transmission growth. And that's going to be challenging without reforms to how we site and permit transmission lines, especially long-distance ones. Improvements of the interconnection process that grid operators run to decide which projects can connect to the grid and how much they have to pay for transmission to do that. And probably permitting reform as well around certain aspects of building on the funding for NEPA review in the bill. Or we're not going to see that pace of expansion most likely. And then that'll constrain the wind and solar growth as well, particularly wind, which has the longest distances usually to connect for transmission. All right, the bill is also going to make a big change in the economics of carbon capture. Right, that's somewhat controversial depending on where you sit and the potential impacts that you might see from these changes. But our estimate is that under the infrastructure law, there's a set of hubs funding for direct air capture and demonstrations of carbon capture in a range of industries. But there's really no business case to expand beyond that under the current, the previous version of the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture. The bill increases it to $85 per ton, as I mentioned before, which we estimate and others have that this makes the economics of carbon capture truly viable across a range of sectors, including the most heavily emitting industries like cement, refineries, and steel or iron production, as well as power plants that generate power from fossil fuels, from gas or coal. Now, not universally, not every facility. Some aren't laid out physically to be able to actually install carbon capture equipment. But more importantly, some are just too far from where we can safely store or use CO2. And so it's likely to be projects that are geographically proximate to geologic storage basins, whether that's in the Gulf Coast region or North Dakota or Wyoming, that are likely to tap into this opportunity first. But it also could spur the growth or initial growth of regional or even long-distance CO2 transport pipelines. We're starting to see some of those proposals come out as well. So we kind of rate limited this based on our analysis in the Net Zero America study, assuming we could grow from about 40 million tons per year to about 200 million tons per year of annual injections of CO2 in storage basins by 2030. That's a pretty rapid growth rate, but we thought was feasible in Net Zero America. And that is a binding constraint in our modeling. So the way to interpret that is to say, if it's harder or slower to permit and build out injection wells and basins to safely store CO2, then carbon capture will be constrained to below that level. And if we can do it faster, there are more economic opportunities, at least in our modeling, than are able to be captured in our core results because of that constraint. And that stays binding through 2032, and then it starts to relax later on. So there's going to be a lot of work to be done to build out this nascent industry, which so far has been restricted to demonstration scale projects, right? First of a kind commercial projects, and really has a very limited transport system in place, mostly used today for enhanced oil recovery. All right, it's going to substantially improve air quality as well. These are estimates from a reduced form model. So Denise and I have been talking about how we could do this in more detail. But these are estimates of the annual avoided mortalities just from PM 2.5 exposure. And again, only the mortalities, not all of the hospitalizations and asthma attacks and lost work days that come from being sick or ill from air pollution exposure. The estimate is that we could be saving about 5,900 lives annually by 2030, growing to about 9,600. So say roughly 10,000 annual deaths avoided by 2035, a significant savings.
And I would say this is very likely an underestimate.
An underestimate, right?
Yep.
That's good. That's where we want to be, right? If we're going to be conservative. Cumulatively, that's about 35,000 premature deaths over the first decade of the law. And if you value that the way the EPA does in its cost-benefit analysis based on the value of statistical life, which is an admittedly ethically fraught subject, so I'm not endorsing it, I'm just saying this is what EPA does, that's about $300 billion or more of avoided damages from all the people who died. You know, if you prefer to think of people not as lives saved, but as dollars, it's $300 billion, which is on the same order of magnitude as the Congressional Budget Office's score for the budgetary impact of the bill. So the way I think about it is basically, if you don't care at all about climate change, you don't care at all about insourcing domestic manufacturing of these important growing industries, you don't care at all about avoiding, or reducing our exposure to oil price volatility and building a more stable, reliable energy system. If you only care about air pollution, this is enough to justify the cost of the bill. And that's consistent with a lot of other research in the air pollution and public health space, that the near-term co-benefits, or maybe we should call them primary benefits, of building a cleaner energy economy are worth it, even without considering the avoided damages from climate change down the line, which are admittedly a lot harder to pin on a single piece of legislation, right? Because it depends on what the whole rest of the world does too. And then the final thing is unemployment. We don't capture the supply chain side of the situation except for wind and solar manufacturing, but we do, and we don't capture the demand-related employment in things like energy efficiency installations or heat pumps. But on the supply side of the economy, we want to look at this transition because we're going to see declining fossil energy production, growing wind and solar and other clean energy industries. So what's the net impact of that on employment in energy supply-related sectors? And what we estimate is that there'll be about 1.7 million net jobs additionally in the energy supply sectors by 2030. So that's after accounting for about 100,000 jobs lost in oil and gas production and coal mining, and accounting for the 1.8 or so million jobs employed in wind and solar and grid primarily. Those are the big ones, and then additional growth in CO2 transport and storage, biomass, and later on a little bit in hydrogen, which we don't estimate here. We try to, this is a rough one, but we're trying to estimate how much insourcing is likely to occur of our domestic supply chains. So for wind, we already produce about 65 or 70% of domestic content that goes into a wind farm is produced here in the United States. there's not much of a cost premium for US production of wind components because they're so big. Shipping costs from overseas are pretty high. And so labor cost advantages, things like that internationally don't kind of wash out. So we have a lot of US production. The thing that's held back US manufacturing of wind has really been the on-again, off-again nature of the production tax credit that builds the industry, the deployment or demand for the product. With 15 years or so of stable demand, and growing forecasts, that's going to change as well. So we'll see a lot more investment probably because of that. The big one and the huge growth opportunity is in solar, where we only produce about 5% of the content of a solar panel and solar farm is produced domestically. And we basically ceded that entire industry to China and Southeast Asia. There is a cost premium. We estimated, Aaron Mayfield and I estimated another study we produced last year, not a significant one, a few percentage points, higher cost for producing in the US. And the bill more than covers that by offering a 10% bonus tax credit. So 10% higher investment tax, 10 percentage points higher investment tax credit, or a 10% higher production tax credit if you source at least half or 55% of the content domestically. And so it also includes production subsidies directly for manufacturers to produce wind and solar components in the US. And we're about to estimate, probably in a forthcoming project, the levels that are set in the bill compared to our estimates of the cost premiums. At first glance, they look pretty close. So we're sort of going to make it economically advantageous to produce in the US, and you get a bonus on the demand side for the customers that are buying these products to buy it from American manufacturers. And so because solar is growing so much and we're going to potentially be building up to roughly 50% market share, so 10x increase in our market share, there's like 900,000 new manufacturing jobs in solar created by 2030. So potentially a huge driver of manufacturing investment and employment. And so you can see that the total is about 950,000 additional manufacturing jobs, a lot more than in construction and installation related jobs, trades, construction, professional services. All right, that's it. It's a big bill. There's a lot of specifics, a lot of things in it. Happy to answer any questions that we have with the time remaining, and encourage you all to check out repeatproject.org for more information. Thank you.
Jesse, for a great summary of great good news.
Yeah, it's good to have some good news. Yeah.
Are there questions?
Lots. Yeah, over here first, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's indeed very good news. I'm just wondering, when you show some numbers for the emissions, the carbon emissions of the US, do these numbers include the imported emissions?
Should start putting that on my charts because I always get this question. No, it does not include imported emissions. Those are domestic emissions, which is also what we count when we pledged we're going to cut emissions 50% internationally. Right? It's the domestic inventory, and we use the same accounting methods as the EPA, which in the case of methane, for example, are somewhat dated. They use the fourth assessment report's global warming potential, which is now up from 25 to 30 in the latest one. But to be consistent, so we can compare with the inventory and with the 50% goal, we use the same methods as the EPA. That does add I think last time I checked, somewhere around 5 or 6% to domestic emissions, but it's not increasing that fast. So the downward trend that I showed is true. It's just you shift the intercept up a bit.
It's quite easy to reduce the carbon emissions by just having electric cars and
Yep.
making the lift and batteries.
Yeah, and I should say we don't account for specifically, this would be a good future research project, the industrial energy consumption that may go along with the insourcing of those sectors. Instead, what we assume is the same share of GDP is domestic versus imported going forward. So no further offshoring, but also no net onshoring. That's our kind of default assumption. And it could be different from that. So there is some importance there. Although I should say, it is a second order effect relative to our own domestic emissions. Yeah. Let's go way to the back, Rachel.
I have two questions. I'm curious about to what extent your modeling downscaling accounts for future climate resilience requirements that are in the bill. And then my other question is how your model does compared to some other historical bill, like what kind of validations you guys are doing with your model. I'm thinking how well does your model do compared to our assumptions and what actually happens after our.
Yeah, great questions. So we're not really accounting for climate resilience, so that neither the threat side or the potential benefits of the bill. Again, that's another whole set of modeling tools. There is some active work, as you know, here to try to look at that. So no, we don't account for that. Sorry, your second question was, how do we validate? Yeah, so this is a perennial challenge when you're trying to model the future, right? So, when you're modeling a physical system that follows physical laws, you can validate against those physical laws, right? Observations versus reality. The challenge here is we're trying to model decision making as well. And so the best we can do is try to parameterize the models accurately to capture the physical and engineering constraints and to validate that those work reasonably well. And that's where the Evolved Energy Research RIO model is better than almost all the other available, I'd say all of them really, economy-wide models, because it has a much higher level of resolution in the electricity sector for the kinds of operational and flexibility constraints that we need to run a system with a lot of renewables in it, a lot of wind and solar. It's not as good as an electricity sector only model, like the type that we've developed in my lab as well. And we're trying to kind of bridge that gap in future research. But we're trying to, it is much better than other models at capturing those relationships. And that becomes increasingly important as wind and solar grow and as electricity becomes more central in the rest of the economy. Now, how do we capture decision making? That's really the hard part. And that's where I'd say these are not really predictions as much as internally consistent scenarios, right, that explore where things are going to go and the magnitude of impact. And the good news is that there are 2 other efforts that we're modeling these bills, one from Rhodium Group and one from Energy Innovation Consultancy. They used entirely different models, structurally entirely different, like not even just different versions of optimization models, but wholly different classes of models. And of course, their own different set of expert judgments about how to represent the policies. And we all came into the same ballpark, right, of a 37 to 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. So I think that gives us some confidence in the sort of magnitude of the effect, but of course there's tons of imprecision. Oh, I should say, our models are precise, but maybe not so accurate, right? There's a lot of error bars. So we're about to go back and redo all of this analysis, looking at, focused on one particular type of uncertainty, which is our judgments about how the policies should be implemented in the model and how effective they are. And so anywhere we made that kind of judgment call, we're going to do a consistently conservative set of assumptions, consistently optimistic set, and then a kind of a middle ground case. And then instead of having a single estimate, we'll have a nice cone of uncertainty, which is more reasonable, right? These are like point sources with no error bars. You should never trust somebody like that, so don't trust me at all. But we tried to model this bill within 1 week of passage, and that we can only do one case, so that's what we did. There's also, so in terms of backcasting, there are some exercises that try to do that, but it's really hard because what you need to know is what everybody knew in 2009 when they made the decisions under the Recovery Act. And it's really hard to know that, right? And then that was that moment in time, but then if you're trying to model the next 10 years, other stuff happened after that. So capturing all that in a model is very challenging, and I should say it becomes sort of epistemologically impossible to truly validate these kinds of models, and that's just the challenge of this type of modeling. We're not modeling a physical system. So keep that all in mind as a caveat. We have a nice disclaimer in the report on like how to interpret these results, which is, this is what makes economic sense. It's what responds to the physical realities that we're modeling, but clearly there are behavioral decisions and non-financial barriers and frictions that we're not capturing very well. Okay, great. Here? Yeah.
Speaking of precision, I think, and things that you're not following necessarily well, but still hoping you have some perspective on it. So it seems like public utility commissions, individual utilities, state regulators can have a dramatic impact either to drag this out or to accelerate it, or maybe sort of a flywheel and have better policy solve some more.
Yep.
Through things like implementing better over distribution systems like Congress or whatever.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious, if you think about the barriers, the basic technical, political, other barriers, what kind of tools do they have at their disposal? How can folks help them solve those barriers?
Yeah.
Even down to a particular utility for PUCs, do you think a particular advanced on this versus common?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a huge range. I teach a class in the spring on, it covers electricity regulation, and I like to point out that there's good regulation in good markets, there's bad regulation, bad market design, and they're very diverse. The first thing that everybody needs to do across all industries, including electricity, is throw out whatever plans they thought made sense before, right? Because we just had this huge uncertainty, this huge policy uncertainty resolve, right? So instead of this cloud of who the heck knows what Congress is going to do, it's now clear. And it's a big deal. It fundamentally changes all of the economic decisions. And so I saw a colleague, an old friend of mine, tweet about Duke Energy's latest resource plan, where they're arguing in front of the commission that they should not have to update the plan they did a year or two ago, because that's just a lot of work, and we had to freeze things in time and give us a break. Let's continue with our plan, without this bill. And I'd normally be sympathetic to that. Like, things change. You have to, fix assumptions. We do that in our modeling too. In fact, all this modeling includes 2021 fuel price assumptions, which we're updating now, but also come on, this just changed the economics of everything, right? It covers half the cost potentially of a new nuclear plant or a new wind or solar facility, right? And so to not take that into account would be a dereliction of a regulator's duty to protect the ratepayer interest. And so I'm actually preparing a letter that I'm going to send to all of the regulators that says that. But I mean, this is the first thing, is just start over with all your planning. It's a lot of work, I know, but you know, the fundamental economics have changed, and we have to account for that if we're going to deliver the best benefits in terms of affordability for customers, which is the mandate that every regulator has. So that's the first thing. There's going to be a range of, you know, some utilities will embrace that. They'll see a market opportunity. Others will be slow to change, although I do think, you know, the further out you go, the more likely they can pivot, and so the more they tend to embrace this stuff. But it's sort of when they're locked into a bad decision that they want to defend that takes, you know, more effort to overcome. So there's a lot that, you know, experts can do in those processes to provide evidence, to engage if we have time and ability to do that. You know, ultimately they need to use better modeling tools as well, so we're trying to build those in our group. But yeah, there's all kinds of, you know, decision-making bodies that are going to need to do the right thing to get on this path, and that's really where the next stage of the effort goes. And again, the just thing that has fundamentally changed is that we now have the federal government behind this. And so whereas before, like I got my start in Oregon doing utility regulation, intervening in utility resource plans. And at the time, we successfully got the Oregon Regulatory Commission to start pricing in the risk of future carbon pricing or regulation into the plan. Right? There was no federal regulation, but there could be in the 10 or 20 years that they're looking at. And so, you know, as any risk-adjusted, you know, planning should be doing, you should be accounting for that probability. And we succeeded in Oregon. Other states don't do that, but Oregon does. Well, now it's not a risk anymore. We know it. We know exactly what the federal government's doing, and it's a huge difference. So I think that's what really changes at the state level.
Well, great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.